When you ask composers who their favorite composer is, you get unusual answers. Richard Strauss, for example, who wrote Elektra and Rosenkavalier and great tone poems, Till Eulenspiegel, Zarathustra, his favorite composer was Mozart. Tchaikovsky, this great romantic who wrote music that was so passionate and so full of drama, his favorite composer was Mozart. You wouldn't think that. And they used them a lot. I mean, Strauss, for example, conducted Mozart a lot. Tchaikovsky actually wrote a suite called Mozartiana, where he took Mozart pieces and orchestrated them in the Liszt version, which is a little unusual, but it was still Mozart. But if you ask Brайт Шън, the Chinese-American composer, I think he would say Brahms. And he orchestrated this gorgeous piano piece, Opus 118, number 2 of Brahms, an intermezzo.
To me, this is more than inspiration. I just simply use the Brahms piece, that Opus 118, number 2, which is one of my favorite piano pieces as a pianist. And I made an arrangement to make an orchestra version.
The music is serene and tender, and he uses the orchestra in a very interesting way. So when I say orchestrate, clearly that means taking piano music and putting it in an orchestra. So if you have a single note on a piano, you could play it on, let's say if it were in the middle register, it could be on an oboe or a trumpet or a clarinet or a flute or a violin or a viola or a cello. They could all play the same note. You have to make a decision. What do you want to convey to illuminate the music, but also to keep it interesting? So Brайт begins the piece using flutes and violins to play the melody in a very simple way. This melody then gets played by the oboe and then with the flute. After those repetitions of the melody, the second melody comes in. He puts this into the brass instruments. A conversation between the trumpets and the horns. Then the third section of the work begins, and he again brings the tune into the violins, but he uses the harp as an accompaniment. He uses pizzicato cello bass to give it a little rhythmic interest, something you wouldn't have normally expected from Brahms.
Of course, I went a little bit beyond Brahms' orchestration. I added some things that not traditionally Brahms would do, but I think added to the piece. For example, Brahms rarely used the harp in his music, only a few exceptions, but most of the symphony orchestra works he never used harp, so I used harp. And the pizzicato part that I used as a melodic part, which is also quite unusual, it's a little bit outside Brahms' typical Brahms style.
The chorale of the brass is now repeated, but this time in the strings, and ends with a beautiful quartet for 4 horns. The new material begins. So now this is what we could call the middle section or the B section. The new material begins with the flute and oboe playing the melody. string accompaniment, a lot of pizzicato in the cellos and the violas. Again, it's the kind of thing where I point out the pizzicato, you'll notice it, but if I had not pointed it out, it just seems organic, it seems natural. The repetition of this melody now is played in octaves between the first and second violin, solo, so it's just two players, and a third voice, kind of making it into a trio, and this voice is the voice of the cello. So this is a trio for two violins and a cello, the repetition of that. The third repetition of that melody is now done as a brass chorale. Halfway through, he brings in the harp. You wouldn't expect the harp to be part of a brass chorale, but listen to this. It's really quite magical what he does. Next section begins with the strings playing in this very warm-hearted, loud, thick, gorgeous way. It leads us slowly back to a repetition of the very beginning of the piece, this time done even softer and with more restraint. This time, I pull back and try to make the music just linger a little bit longer in a very soft and beautiful way. Again, the brass chorale comes back as it did the first time. This time, instead of the strings repeating the brass chorale, he uses the woodwinds. What Breit does is he uses his tremendous sensitivity and musical knowledge and imagination to bring this piece to life. Without having analyzed it as I have, it would be fine. You don't need to know that analysis at all. It is just gorgeous. But knowing it just shows you the kind of work that composers do. And I remember when Breit told me he was working on this, he thought it was going to be easy. Well, it turned out to be quite difficult because he was very careful to try to make it seem and feel organic.
I try to use my imagination, the color as a pianist when I perform it on the piano that I couldn't do, because as a pianist we are thinking, oh, this is an oboe playing, this is a horn playing, and this and that. So, in my orchestration of this arrangement, then I try to bring out the colors that I couldn't do as a pianist.
He certainly wasn't trying to orchestrate it in a way that Brahms would, no. But it certainly is true to the spirit of the music.